Welcome to this opening session. Given the night last night, I hope you all have grabbed coffee this morning. It's the only way I'm up and going. Andrew brought his on stage, so that tells you where we are. I'm Dave Egner. I'm the president and CEO of the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation in Detroit and in Western New York. And it's my pleasure to be the interviewer of Andrew McAfee. So let me, instead of jumping to a formal introduction, you have Andrew's bio, and I don't want to read it to you. Instead, I want to tell you a story. It was August of 2017.
Uh-oh, is all I have to say about that.
So, I was running on a beach in northern Michigan on a vacation, very slowly, and I was listening to a podcast of Eric Bjorkfinson, who was the co-author of a small manuscript called Race Against the Machine. I was working at the time for the Hudson Weber Foundation in Detroit and had been working since 1999 on the issue of workforce, particularly for those folks who had not been tied into the job market. And the TED Talk reached a point of talking about the great decoupling, the decoupling of what would be work and productivity. For the first time in modern history, we would see productivity go up with no connection to work. And I literally stopped. I realized that we had been working on the wrong thing, that the workforce activity we were working on not only wouldn't work, it wouldn't last, and we had to make an adjustment. And that's when I learned about the work of Andrew, and then in 2014, I think that's when the second machine age came out. And I realized today we're still working on the wrong thing, and we're still asking the wrong questions. Just as context, I know that we tend to ask three questions as kids grow up. What do you want to be when you grow up? 65% of jobs of the future don't exist today. So we're asking the wrong question. What are you going to major in? 27% of kids graduating college today actually do work in their major. And then what do you do? My grandchildren will work in 17 jobs in 5 different industries. We're asking the wrong questions about work. And a big chunk of that is how technology, artificial intelligence is going to change the world. So with that, I'm going to pose the first question to Andrew. What's the future look like? You're on. I can just sit here the rest of the time.
Different. And in most of the important ways, better. And where it's going to get tricky is in the ways where technology does not automatically make things better. That's where we have some pretty important choices coming up. So let me try to set a little bit of context. About once a century, technology fundamentally changes the world. That happened for the first time in the late 18th century with the steam engine. And if you do any reading or any just research about the course of human history, it's a 2-chapter story. There's a story where basically nothing was happening, and then everything happened. And the Industrial Revolution was that inflection point. It put humanity, whether you look at how many people there were, how wealthy they were, the quality of their lives, our impact on the planet, there's kind of before the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution. So that was the first one. Then around the turn of the 20th century, this incredible trajectory continued because of the 1-2 punch of electricity and internal combustion. And the 20th century was based on those 2 technologies and their spread around the world. Here we are at the third one. And the reason Eric and I have done all this work and written a couple books together is he and I became convinced that we're in the third one of these periods, where because of a combination of the fact that for the very first time, a solid majority of the world's adults have something like this. And we've all been carrying these around for a while. This is incredibly easy to underestimate. But a solid majority of the world's adults, for the very first time in history, are interconnected with each other and can access a decent chunk of humanity's accumulated knowledge and maybe contribute to that knowledge. We have never, ever, ever been here before. Everybody in this room won the birth lottery. We grew up in an environment where we had access to information and knowledge and communications. Most of humanity was just absolutely excluded from that. That's not true anymore. The second thing that's going on is I dropped my phone. This is about resilience, right? The second thing that's going on is that the field of artificial intelligence is finally delivering on its promises. The field of AI is about 60 years old, and for the first 55 of those years, it was over-promising and under-delivering like crazy. And there was a period called the AI winter, where everybody got tired of the hype and the claims, and all the research, all the funding went away. A couple brave souls kind of carried on through that winter, and finally, all of their work is bearing fruit. And when I think about what's happening with AI now, it always reminds me of Hemingway's fantastic quote about how a person goes broke. He says it's gradually and then suddenly. We've been in the gradual part, now it's the sudden part. And one of the great privileges I have is I get to go around and talk to the alpha geeks of the world, the people who are building these technologies and the companies on top of them. And the sense of excitement that I get from these people is unbelievable. What I keep hearing over and over is essentially, man, I wasn't expecting that. Like the progress in my discipline, the progress in what I do, we were making progress before, and now we're just blowing past milestones. We're just hitting benchmark after benchmark out there. So the 21st century is going to be defined, if you're a technologist, by this combination of global interconnectivity for the very first time, and the fact that we finally have, I don't love this phrase, artificial intelligence, we have a colleague. There is another flavor of intelligence out there. I don't think it's going to rise up and kill us, but we do have a partner or a colleague.
So when does Skylink go live, and when do the Terminators take over?
So this is the first question you get, so thank you for the first question. This is the first question you get all the time when you talk about artificial intelligence. And some very smart and accomplished people like Elon Musk are out there with great sincerity sounding the alarm. Elon says we're summoning the demon with this research in AI. I think it is profoundly unhelpful and underinformed nonsense, that line of thought. And did I say that strongly enough? Do I need to be more emphatic about anything? Mainly because, you know, like a lot of technologists, I read a lot of science fiction as a very unpopular 13-year-old. And you read a lot of dystopian science fiction. The mistake is to think that because we have a computer that can play chess and Go and poker at a high level, that all that 13-year-old dystopian sci-fi is now going to happen. It's just a very basic category mistake. Again, I've got the privilege of talking to the people who build these systems. I always outsource my response to the Elon Musk summoning the demon. I outsource my answer to a guy named Andrew Ng, who's just a legendary researcher, a rock star in the world of artificial intelligence. And he says worrying about killer AI and big scary robots right now is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. And what he means by that is, gosh, I guess it's theoretically possible. It's nowhere on the horizon. It's a long, long way off. And my frustration is, don't we have immediate problems to actually spend time on, spend our energy on, and go after, as opposed to this overpopulation on Mars, super distant theoretical stuff? My further frustration is, I think our AI is maybe the most powerful tool we humans have ever invented to help us make progress on super difficult challenges. For example, not cooking the planet is a really important challenge for the 21st century. We have this toolkit that has never been available before, and we're going to demonize it just as it's gaining steam. I find this profoundly frustrating.
So I've two definitions of AI, both terrifying in their own right. One is the one we just, the whole Terminator issue. The other is when my kids reach teenage years, they refer to me as AI, artificial intelligence. That's the other terrifying thing, is change, right?
Yeah.
As we see the world change, it can be terrifying.
Absolutely.
Especially for generations that aren't used to it. So speak about this culturally. How is the culture responding, and how should we be responding?
And this is why I said that this tech progress will help us with a lot of our challenges, but not all of them. And the one that you just identified, in addition to not cooking the planet, dealing with what you just brought up, I think is our great homework for the next generation or two. Because the two laws of technology are, first of all, economists love to talk about pie. I don't quite know why that is, but they always talk about making the pie bigger and growing the pie. The two laws of technology are, first of all, that tech progress grows the pie. It makes us more affluent, more prosperous overall. The second thing technology does is it changes how that pie gets distributed, how it gets sliced up and shared out among people. And there is absolutely no law in economics or technology that says that the way the new technologies are going to divide up that pie is the same way the previous generation of technologies sliced up that pie. The allocation, the sharing could change. It could change a lot. And there's no guarantee that the way technology changes the world is going to strike people as fair or as in keeping with the bargain that they signed up for.
So if I'm a blue-collar truck driver, I should be afraid right now. If that's my only skill.
That is among the jobs that is going to be confronted by a lot of automation. Now, there's this huge debate right now about how quickly that's going to happen. My mantra when it comes to technology is quicker than you think. So I'm kind of on the more aggressive side about when this is going to happen. We have already seen lots of routine blue-collar and lower-skill white-collar jobs be automated away. The year of peak manufacturing employment in the United States was 1979. Our manufacturing industries are a lot bigger. I think they're almost twice as big as they were in 1979. They accomplish all that additional work with fewer human bodies. So we've already seen entire industries where the employment growth got decoupled from the output growth. I don't think that's over at all, especially because we now have technologies that are very good at the truck driving skills, at sensing the environment, making decisions very, very quickly, dealing with fuzzy rules. If you tried to explain all the rules of the road to a piece of software, the formal and the informal ones, it's really hard to do. We are now getting quite good at that. So I'm not saying we're going to have self-driving cars from Florida to Boston in 18 months or anything, but we are going to have them. Now, the number of jobs here is interesting because there are about 3 or 4 million people in America who make their living from driving. And that's a big number, but the American labor market is extremely dynamic. There are more than 1.5 million people laid off every month in America. So the challenge is not, can we absorb 4 million job losses over some period of years? We can absolutely do that raw number. The problem is that it's exactly that demographic that's going to be challenged by by autonomous vehicles that we know has had the most trouble adjusting to the waves of change we've already seen. So 4 million additional people who see their jobs automated and who have real difficulty pivoting their careers, going back into the workforce, that's the challenge we need to focus on.
I'm a blue-collar kid. I'm the first kid to graduate high school.
Wow.
Everybody was, Dad built train cars for a living. My grandfather worked Monsanto for 42 years. They would be terrified by the notion that the promise made to them of work hard, have a strong back, and you'll have benefits and retirement money for the rest of your life before you die. That promise is gone.
And to oversimplify just a little bit, that was an accurate promise made to your dad's generation,
Right.
Your grandfather's generation. You look at the post-war decades in America, and we had this bottomless thirst for lower-skilled, less educated labor, right? When we had factories, we put them to work really well, and what they got in exchange for that was something like the American dream. There were a whole lot of solid middle-class families and households created out of that work. I basically agree with you. Those jobs are in the rearview mirror, and they're disappearing quite quickly.
So what do we do with those? How do we help those people retrain? What does that look like?
We don't have a great answer to that question. If you look at the history of mid-career retraining efforts, it is not a really positive history. So when what we're doing has not been working very well, in my world, the response is to do more different things, not to keep doubling down on what doesn't work. But during times of great change, we need experimentation, we need innovation, we need lots of shots on goal to try to figure out what does work. And there's grounds for optimism. I was talking with Hal Varian a little while back, who's the chief economist at Google, and he says, I think I'm remembering this right, he said there are about 500 million how-to videos on YouTube watched every day. I think that's fantastic. All of us, I think most of us in the room benefited from a pretty good education. Again, we won the birth lottery, that we had access to this great education. If you want to get skilled up on almost anything, there are really good resources available online very often at low cost or for free. And one of the things I'm excited about is trying to figure out how to take advantage, how to take that body of training materials, of how-to, and actually get that into the hands and into the minds of people. You have to be kind of you have to be aware that this exists. You have to be a tenacious self-starter to kind of get your education completely solo. Most of us don't do that. Education is a group-level activity, and how we combine the in-person, the social aspects of education, the in-person stuff, a classroom, with this amazing body of material out there, that's where a lot of the magic is going to happen.
This is where I get scared for the immediate future. As human beings, change is so hard for us.
Yeah.
And you're looking at a need to change the entire education system, change the way workforce happens, have employers wake up to a different reality. How do we even start that conversation? And right now, I mean, if you look in Washington and most of our state capitals, it's the fear of this change that's driving a lot of the behavior around economics. I mean, when both parties came out saying they were going to save coal mining, anyone who had read your book said that's the most insane thing ever.
Yeah, I think that was chapter 7. It was the most insane thing ever. Coal mining coming back, right? Yeah, the great frustration, and the reason I'm a little worried about things these days is what you say, is that our national level, especially among our elected leaders, our national level conversation is not on point, it's not productive, it's not taking us in the right direction. We're engaging, we all know about the polarization, but there's way too much of the politics of nostalgia and just yearning to go back to, the America of 1962. That's just not one of the things that's going to happen. And I wish that there were just, at the level of our elected leaders, that there was more awareness and more willingness to talk about this. The problem is it's hard to turn this into a happy soundbite.
Yeah.
And I was talking with Alan Blinder, is a really, really good economist. He's at Princeton, and he's pretty honest. He says, look, we economists, our community, we blew it on trade because we kept on saying trade makes the world more prosperous, which is true. What the economics community didn't say was, again, it can change the distribution of all that prosperity. Some people can get left behind by globalization and multinational trade. We should have been more honest about that. We should have found ways to talk about that. We needed elected leaders who would be front and center with that and say, this is not hopeless, but this is a transition. It's not going to be awesome every day for everybody. The same thing is true about technology. So the first thing we need to do is start having more honest conversations about it.
It's a tough one. I mean, it's when you're fearful, you don't want to have an honest conversation.
And there's another thing that makes this difficult, which is that these are really uncertain times. And not only is the future hard to predict, there are some trends going on that I don't think we understand very well. Business dynamism in America, almost any way that you look at it, whether it's the number of new startups, the number of new establishments formed, people moving across the country, labor mobility, almost anything you want to think about. Business dynamism in America is on a long, slow, steady decline. This is really worrying. We get distracted by Silicon Valley because we hear all these amazing stories, and Silicon Valley is amazing. It's really the exception and not the rule. And if you look at the number of Americans who are employed by large, old companies, that number is actually going up over time. What I think we'd want to see, yeah, absolutely. When I think what we'd want to see is more people being employed by younger, faster growing companies, more dynamism around the country. We don't quite understand what's going on. One of my colleagues says, right now it looks like death by 1,000 cuts. We had better be able to identify what the most serious of those cuts is and figure out what to do about them. Because some things that I walked around thinking about the American economy actually are becoming less true over time.
So should we be teaching entrepreneurship at a different level? What's the solution to that? I'm from Detroit, so you talk about the epitome of resisting change. The manufacturing world in Detroit refused change for so long that until the last crisis in the late noughts, there was no adjustment in the economy whatsoever. We were just one Chevy away from a big comeback. How is it about the education system? How do you culturally make this shift so that we're teaching self-reliance, independence, the ability to shift and work for a younger, faster company?
I think a lot of us know who Peter Thiel is. He's an incredibly smart, very thoughtful guy who I disagree with on just about everything, which is fantastic because you can have, and he's a wonderful guy to talk with because he can explain, he doesn't get personal, he can explain why he believes what he believes, but I just find myself disagreeing with him about almost everything, with one exception. He and I were on stage having a debate about some of these things, and he said, almost everyone who says they're teaching critical thinking is not teaching critical thinking. They're teaching some flavor of indoctrination.
Yeah, agreed.
And as much as I wanted to argue with Peter, I'm like, yeah, that's probably right. So changing that, my home industry of education is a large, monolithic, slow-moving, resistant to change, let's be honest, cartel. None of that. Great, I get a hand for that, thank you. None of that bodes really well for the kinds of rapid adjustments that you're asking about.
Right.
And we're doing a wonderful job, especially with primary education, we're doing a wonderful job of turning out the kinds of citizens and the kind of workers we needed 70 years ago. And by that, I mean, think about your dad and your grandfather going to work. The educational system was designed to turn out people who had basic skills, but I think more fundamentally got accustomed to sitting in an orderly grid of some kind all day, doing a series of things that they were told to do by a voice of authority, and executing on those instructions. And we needed a lot of people like that in 1957. We just don't need people with those skills right now. We really, really don't. We do have some clarity about the skills that we do need out there in the workforce. And I think they fall into three big categories. The first one is obvious. We need STEM skills. You need quantitative reasoning. In the world that we're creating, not being able to think clearly, and in many cases with numbers, with some level of quantitative reasoning, that's a handicap. So we need decent STEM skills. I think even more important, and the research is pretty clear on this, we need to be teaching social skills. And that sounds kind of vague and squishy. It's actually not. We know that the ability to negotiate, to motivate, to persuade, and to coordinate, those four things, we know those skills are getting more valuable in the labor market even more quickly than STEM skills are. So these are high-level social skills. They're about how you can sense what's going on in a group, get them aligned, get them to go do something. This is what managers do. It's what leaders and executives do. Our educational system does a lousy job of teaching those things. I think all of us who have acquired any of those abilities did it outside the boundaries of the classroom, right? And then third is the ability to not just problem solve, but problem find. Just to identify the next really important thing to go work on or to go tackle. This is what I think entrepreneurs are so brilliant at, is saying, well, let's go fix that. That doesn't have to be as lousy as it currently is. But again, when you're in that orderly grid of desks, just listening to the voice of authority all day, questioning authority was not really what my primary education was all about, right? So teaching people to learn how to ask questions and go poke at the world is a really valuable set of skills that we are not doing a great job of teaching.
I agree with that. It's interesting though. We're at this very interesting juncture where we're conflicted on how to approach this in some respects. So, and using a little different terminology, for 10 years I've been saying we've got to teach people how to rock climb instead of ladder climb.
Ha! Yeah.
Right. So it's find the next toehold and make your way toward it. It's identify the opportunity and move toward it.
Good.
But when we have this current skills gap, we're starting to push everything into a box of train for the skills, forget liberal arts, humanities. Should we be teaching more humanities and liberal arts? What's the balance here?
We should, but in my community, I hear that dangled as a panacea.
Okay, yeah.
And that a liberal arts education teaches you to be this wonderful, exalted thinker. I think that's a lot of liberal arts scholars patting themselves on the back, quite honestly. Right. I really... Again, this is where Peter Thiel and I actually found ourselves categorically agreeing. It turns out, for example, we have all heard about the need to teach ethics and how we should be putting more ethics in the curriculum. It turns out professional ethicists do not behave any more ethically than the rest of us. That is an actual finding from the research. So I'm wary of these canned answers for what we need to go do. where people who have really wonderful jobs in the English department at Princeton talk about more of that. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. So I think if we can actually turn out more problem identifying, socially adept, numerically or quantitatively comfortable people, I think that'll solve a lot. It'll go a long, long
So the
way.
education system of Horace Mann we've been using for the last 200 years is wrong?
I think he was right at the time, but he was right for the industrial era when we needed armies of clerks and assembly line workers to build the economy. We do not need those armies anymore. Now, a lot of us have heard about these worries of a jobless future. We might get there. We are not there yet, and it is not anywhere evident in the data. If this is one of my hobbies, is every month when the economic data comes out, I just graph how the economy is growing, and then I graph how many hours of labor were needed to generate all that
Well,
economy.
you're fun at parties.
I really am,
Yeah.
right? Corner me at a cocktail party. It's going to be fantastic. And the gap between those two lines is growing. That's called productivity. We want that gap to grow. But what has not happened is that line of hours worked, it has not leveled off, let alone started to come down. The total number of, the total number of hours worked in an economy dips during recessions, and that's it. We've had this very, very long economic expansion. Month by month, the number of hours needed to generate the economy keeps growing. So I see that, and I calm down about the jobless future of robots everywhere. I've written about robots and AI and how fantastic they are. We just don't see the jobless future in the data yet. So I've got my Silicon Valley friends who a lot of them are just really hopped up about the universal basic income because they say, look, in the very near future, we're going to automate everybody out of existence, and to prevent social unrest and all that stuff, we need to give everybody money. I disagree with that for a bunch of different reasons. The first one is that we don't see that in the data yet. So let's not solve a problem that does not exist right now. We need to figure out, for all those additional hours of labor, how do we make them the kinds of decent jobs that your ancestors
And fulfilling. The
and
psychology
decent and
on
fulfilling that your
the
ancestors.
psychology is overwhelming that
Yeah.
if it's a jobless society, we've got to find something to fulfill ourselves.
And I think that is the thing that actually does keep me up at night. A lot of us have probably heard about the deaths of despair in America. I wish I could tell you that is that's hype. It's not. The data are actually really, really scary. The suicide rate in America is higher now than at any time in the post-war period. The last time we had a suicide rate this high was during the Great Depression, with 20% unemployment and no safety net. And the drug overdose rate in America has doubled within a decade. The scariest thing for me is that those trends are going in exactly the wrong direction during a long and sustained economic recovery. So this is not because of dire poverty or starvation or anything. I think it's exactly what you said. People just feel left out, left behind, that the things have become deeply unfair, that they're isolated, and I think that's a lot of what's going on.
And hasn't our screen time created part of this issue too? I mean, every time you get a dose of dopamine, every time you're going to your Facebook page to see if anybody commented or liked your last.
There is some of that going on, but actually, teen suicides, for example, are not at an all-time high. They're actually lower than they were.
That's not what the media would have us believe. I mean, the
yes.
fear of social media piece. So I didn't.
But again, that's one of my favorite Twitter accounts. It's called the Pessimist Archive, and it just goes back, and it's an archive about blah is destroying society, and the only thing that changes is blah. So right now, it's social media is absolutely destroying society. 20 years ago, the TV was destroying society. You can go back and find the radio was destroying society. The novel was destroying society. I'm really skeptical of the constant freaking out about whatever the latest technology is destroying society. So what I try to do when I see those headlines, I go try to find more systematic data, and it kind of tells me that that there are challenges. And Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff just wrote a great book called The Coddling of the American Mind about how we're probably overprotecting young people in some ways. I completely agree with that. I don't love this narrative that screen time is turning us into zombies or suicidal wrecks or anything. I think the problem is in different demographic groups,
right.
And I think the problem is because of this deterioration in social capital. that really did define a lot of the post-war decades in America. There's this wonderful interview earlier this year with Secretary of Defense Mattis, and the interviewer asked him what he was most worried about. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking he's going to talk about ISIS or North Korea or China. And he said, the lack of friendliness back home. And he said, when our vets come back, some of them have PTSD, but a lot of them just are struck by the sense of loneliness and isolation and alienation because they're used to being part of something bigger called the US military. Then they're dropped back into this society where a lot of the bonds, a lot of the social capital are fraying and going away, and we're doing a lot more just kind of blind yelling at each other.
We're going to turn to questions from all of you in just a moment. So there'll be some folks with microphones out. If you can show if you've got a question, raise your hand, and the microphone will find you. While we're waiting for that to happen, did you ever believe that your work would have this profound intersection with psychology? I mean, that's ultimately what's happening now.
That's absolutely right. I'm trying to turn myself into a hopefully not terrible amateur psychologist and sociologist, because I've come to the conclusion that the technology toolkit is astonishing and getting better very quickly. The economic, the dollars problems are real problems, but they are addressable problems. The problems that I'm really worried about are exactly what you just highlighted. There are things that are happening with social capital and communities in the country today, and the sense of pretty profound hopelessness that a lot of people are apparently feeling. One of the things that really worries me is when you look back at history, the Industrial Revolution was a huge positive for humanity. It also gave us Marxism, right? So you can have profoundly bad ideas come up and take hold during these periods of deep, deep transition. We can seize the imagination and the thoughts of a lot of people and go in a deeply bad direction during these periods of profound change. And the reason I push back against some of my really well-minded colleagues is they start to say things like, well, I guess that market economy was a good idea, but it doesn't work anymore. Hold on. Let's not get carried away. And I'm really kind of worried that we're going to have another round of deeply bad ideas, or go back and rerun that experiment and do some things that we know don't work very well.
Wow, I'm glad you're looking at psychology, given everything that's happening. Questions? Yes, right there.
My name is Jose Fernandez. I'm from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and I have a foundation called Kinesis. And one of the things that I do is I have an afternoon school. And I developed that afternoon school because I could not get academia to understand what I wanted to do. And that was to teach technology to students. I wanted to certify them as Microsoft Office specialists.
Wow.
So when they go to college, they are prepared more to do what they're doing. I wanted to teach leadership, and I wanted to do the same at the same time. And I wanted to have them do English and Spanish and mathematics, and do it with technology. But I use a system called blended learning. Okay, I did an experiment in Puerto Rico with Microsoft, and I gave them the 28 kids the course to take. We gave them 4 months, and we explained to them at the beginning what they had to do. And I had only 10 passed. When I introduced a person, a teacher, I gave them 16 hours. As they developed, and the Microsoft system allows you to see what you're doing wrong. So they concentrate on what they're doing right, and then tackle the one that is wrong. So we are graduating 24 out of 25. We have sent 2 classes of 100, 40 to the United States and 60 to Puerto Rico, and they're doing marvelous. We used to get $20,000 scholarships. Now we get $55,000 scholarships.
Wow. So,
and
Andrew,
it's all because of the technology.
Wow.
And the things that we teach. I have been able to raise.
So
my question is that I agree with you, okay?
Right. But I think you raise a really terrific set of points there. The systems have not yet embraced technology as a tool for learning in a way that's meaningful. And we have a system fighting
Yeah.
the technology. How do we
This-
fix that?
You should not expect incumbent industries to embrace the disruptive technology. That's not a thing that we see happen, with some exceptions. Really well-led incumbent organizations do this. In general, they don't. So we're seeing a lot of these end runs around the existing system, in this case, the educational system. But I think your example is a great one. The world's most popular way to learn a second language now is a free app. It's called Duolingo. A lot of us have probably messed around with Duolingo, have kids doing it. It is the world's most popular way to learn a second language. And for people who are diligent about it, the founder told me that a lot of people take it in the Spanish-speaking world to get their English proficiency up to the point that it improves their careers. And I said, what? He said, think about a waiter at a resort, at a hotel. He said, we can give that person good enough English skills that they can go get a job at the good resort on the island and really put their life on a different trajectory. So there are all these fantastic green shoots out there of technology. Can I say one more thing? In too many cases, they're having to do an end run around the existing educational system and figuring out how to improve that situation is important. I want to say there is one incredibly important exception, which is MIT, where I work. I want you all to be super clear on this. We're doing all kinds of there's just wonderful work happening throughout the Institute to try to fix this problem. One thing we're doing, which is amazing, we are offering online-only courses in some of our majors. And for people who do the best on those online-only courses, we say, in the first year of the program, we say, great, come to campus for the second year. You've been admitted. We didn't know about you in advance. You didn't really apply. You did really well in that course. Come to campus, spend a year here instead of 2. It's cheaper for you, and we'll give you the degree. We'll give you the proper MIT degree on the back end of that. I love ideas like this, and we're seeing more and more of them over time.
So group of foundation folks in the room, many trying to disrupt education. But our disruptions have been primarily mirroring the system. Charter schools.
Yeah.
Most charter schools were knockoffs of the existing system. They didn't really create a disruption. They created a market ripple. Should we be funding things that are more disruptive? Should we be funding private enterprise to build more apps? If we want to disrupt education, how do we do that?
I think our colleague had a great word. The blended approaches that we see are working very well. I love the Duolingo story, but like I said earlier, it doesn't look like purely digital solo solutions are a rising tide that lifts all boats, which is really what we want our educational system to do. The way I think about what technology alone can do in education, it's kind of a diamond detector. In other words, it'll find the smart, tenacious, determined people and upskill them. What we also need to do is lift the tide more generally. I do think there's a value to something called a school and something called a classroom and something called an adult in the room, which is why I think a lot of us have worked with charter schools. I do think you want that kind of environment for the kids. I think that in many cases, we're not bold enough about how that charter school needs to differ from the old-fashioned educational system. So a lot more project-based learning, a lot more loosey-goosey style classrooms. I had the great good luck of being a Montessori kid for the first years of my education. And the school ran out in the 3rd grade. And so in the 4th grade, I had to go into the normal public school system. And I thought that there was an extended kind of candid camera joke being played on me. Because I was used to this completely hippie style of education where you gave the little kids autonomy and they wandered around and decided what they wanted to go work on next, and the teacher was there to help you with that process of discovery. It was amazing. And there is, inside high tech, you probably know, there's a thing called the Montessori Mafia. It turns out when you look at the founders of Google, I think Jeff Bezos is a Wikipedia kid, is a Montessori kid. The founder of Wikipedia is a Montessori kid. There's this Montessori mafia where the tech elite have realized that this style of education, this very loose, let the kids go poke at the world style, seems to be super effective. And a lot of my techie friends in San Francisco are, with their philanthropy, starting up very alternative, hippie kinds of schools. When I went into the normal 4th grade, I thought that I'd done something wrong and my parents had shipped me to the gulag. I did not understand why. I went home and said, look, I'm sorry. I'll clean my room. You just tell me what it is. I don't want to go back there.
Wow. And that's the system we're still using. That's it.
Largely, yeah.
Other questions? There's one up here. Oh, right there.
Yes. You've been talking about the manufacturing economy, and most mature countries have gone into a service-related economy. Please talk about technology as it relates to the service economy.
Yeah, it's a great point, because we harp on manufacturing way too much, because in the entire rich world, it's a pretty small portion of the labor force and a declining percentage of the labor force. And like you say, the service economy is where all the action is at these days, which is great. There are a couple challenges with service economy jobs. The first one is that they tend to be more geographically concentrated. So, service jobs are in-person jobs. You need to be close to the other person. They tend to concentrate geographically in cities, which is not necessarily bad, except that then those jobs kind of don't exist in a lot of the rest of the country. So our economy is geographically concentrating. And for people who don't necessarily want to move to the big city, that's an actual challenge. I've been doing some research back at MIT, and during this most recent economic recovery, and again, this is a long, sustained economic recovery, something like 20% of the counties in America have lost GDP. Their economies are shrinking in about 20% of the counties in America. So one challenge with the service economy jobs is that they tend to concentrate in cities. The other challenge is kind of the gig economy challenge, and that high-end service jobs are fantastic. That's investment banker, data scientist, machine learning specialist. Those are really good jobs. Low-end service jobs tend to be less well-paid, more precarious. In a lot of cases, if you're doing shift work, the shifts are unpredictable. It's a lot tougher to plan your family and your life around that. And then there's all of this new platform-based, digitally facilitated work, which is still very small as a percent of the economy, but it's growing. So a lot of the service jobs are inferior in some ways to the classic manufacturing 40-hour-a-week plus benefit kinds of jobs. I think that is a fixable problem. And the way I would fix that is by having a larger earned income tax credit, a bigger negative income tax, so that if people are out there working, trying to participate in the economy, but their market wage is not very high, we can top that up. We know how to do that. The EITC, there's no silver bullet in policy. The EITC, which already exists, is the closest thing to a silver bullet that I've ever seen, because all the research I read says it does exactly what it was designed to do. It encourages people to work, and it tops up their income. I think that's fantastic. I hope you can tell by now I'm kind of a frothing at the mouth capitalist. I do think that our safety net in this country is patchy and inadequate. And I love what a lot of the European countries have done. I might not go as far as Denmark, but I would rethink pretty deeply the safety net that we have to try to help out people who are getting left behind but still want to sign up and want to participate in that bargain.
Great. Next question.
Where are we?
Right, over here.
I'm Rebecca Dunn. It was great, wonderful lecture.
Could we all start our questions that way? That's fantastic.
I want to ask you how you feel this is going to affect the financial markets in the sense of predicting, say for the stock market, both futures trading and the regular stock traders, but the future where computers are taking over and predicting people's behavior.
Yeah, it's such a great question. Again, I have this great privilege that I get to go talk to like leading edge geeky people in different fields. The leading edge people who invest for a living that I talk to say that there's a really interesting shift going on. And this is not my world, so let me try to describe the shift and I'll get some of it wrong. What people who run hedge funds tell me is what I used to do is compensate people extraordinarily well if they were generating returns for my fund. And if they started to generate less impressive returns, I'd take away their capital And if they started to do better, I'd give them more capital. But they were extremely well compensated, very, very high-powered incentives to try to have good ideas about the future and about how asset prices were going to change. What I've heard more than once is what I'm doing now, say these hedge fund owners, is I have a bunch of pretty well-paid, salaried people. And their job is to tee up investment hypotheses that the machines, though, go then investigate. Because what I hear over and over is I've become convinced that the machines are better at figuring out if that's a good strategy and then executing that strategy than the human beings are. What I hear, we still need the human beings to tee up the idea, like, might this work or might this not work? That's very different from, this will clearly work, I'm a genius, I'm going to go execute on this strategy, and if I succeed, you're going to give me more capital to play with. So I think there's a pretty big shift. A lot of the finance jobs are the high-end finance jobs. It looks like they're getting hollowed out because the more geeky, the more computer digital-oriented investment strategies are just doing better out there. Now, will that change during a different economic climate? Will that change during a recession? Stay tuned. Unfortunately, we're going to find out one day or another. But right now, that world of investing and asset trading, it's not human-free at all, but the roles of the humans are different, and in many cases, they're smaller than they used to be.
Wow. Well, other question? There's one up here in the front.
Where are we?
And this gentleman has laughed at all of our wisecracks, so he should get a chance to go.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Two-part question. One, I just came from a meeting at the Cleveland Clinic Innovations Summit, and they pointed out that medical data is doubling every 73 days and medical knowledge every 78 months. And their position was AI should refer to augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, as more accurate and precise way to think about it and promote it and approach it. And so my question is, do you agree with that, and what's your response? And secondly, based on my anecdotal observation, I decided that we need more applied data analytics people, so I'm planning to launch a master's degree in applied data analytics in the fall. Is that smart or stupid? That's a two-part question.
Yep. The second one's easier to answer. I think it's really smart, as long as it's a well-designed program, and let's grant that. Higher ed is, I've said, it's a slow-moving industry. It's waking up to this huge thirst out there. So there are a lot of degree programs being launched to try to give people the skills of tomorrow. I would, as you're thinking about that, I would just make sure that you've got the school and got the faculty on board to try hard to teach tomorrow's skills as opposed to yesterday's skills. Okay. The first question you ask is this fascinating one about the explosion in digital data in all fields, but you asked about medicine, and about this really tricky question, how do we bring together the skills of a human physician or diagnostician with what technology can do? I think that the next generations are going to look back at our current era of medicine and think it's about as barbaric as putting leeches on people and drilling holes in skulls to let the bad vapors out. Because I just think that they're going to look at it and they said, wait a minute, you were actually relying on a human being to diagnose what was wrong with you? Were you people crazy? Were they looking at bumps on your head? What was wrong with you people? The idea that we can actually ask any single human to stay on top of all of the knowledge in their subdiscipline of medicine and apply it correctly in each and every case. When you phrase it that way, it's ludicrous. So you talk about augmented intelligence. I think the really interesting question is which kind of intelligence is going to augment which kind of intelligence. Right now, when we talk about augmented intelligence, it's usually that the human gets helped out by a piece of technology. I think maybe that's what's happening now, and maybe that's what we need to say to bring people on board. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think in the future, the digital intelligence is actually going to lead and should lead, and the person will be in the loop or on call to make sure the machine doesn't do something that's just profoundly stupid or just lacks common sense. because all of our efforts to teach machines common sense, the things that a 2-year-old knows about the world, all of our attempts to teach machines common sense have been weird failures, miserable failures. So the really good news is that machines and minds make very different kinds of mistakes. And if we can bring those two kinds of things together, then we've got an opportunity to do much, much better in medicine and lots of other fields. We are still too parochial right now, and all of our minds go around thinking, well, I can use the machine to augment my beautiful mind. It's super uncomfortable. In a lot of cases, that's going to get flipped around. And the person's job is to kind of look, I think in the future, will be to look at the diagnosis, look at the report, look at the whatever, and say, does that pass my smell test or not? I don't exactly know how that transition is going to happen, because you can imagine the medical community makes academia look fleet of foot and really kind of embracing of change. But we need to do that to take better care of people.
Wow. So kind of a follow-up to that, as you're talking about the data analytics, the other pieces, as you look out in the future, college degrees matter?
Unfortunately, education still matters.
Education is one thing, but the credential of a college degree versus other credentialing and stacking, does this do-it-yourself education along with augmented intelligence change the way that we look at college degrees?
Only when employers stop requiring that degree as a ticket to get in the door. And most employers right now still require you, like, when you go look at the job
Right, it's part of the funnel. It cuts you out if you don't get
You're just out of the funnel. Dental hygienist is now typically a job that requires a bachelor's degree. This was not the case a couple generations ago. Our teeth have not become that much more complex. But it's just that this is, from the employer's point of view, it's costless to require that credential, and maybe it's a decent signal about whether or not the person's going to work out. It's actually a pretty lousy signal, but the employer is not bearing the cost of that person having to go get that degree. So we've got this pretty severe mismatch. When I go look at a lot of the tech firms that I get to spend time with, especially for their more geeky fields, they have walked away from that requirement. And they don't care where you went to school, what your major was, what your transcript was, because their data, their evidence has shown them that doesn't predict how people are going to do in their jobs very well at all. So they're coming up with these really interesting alternative ways to assess people on the way in the door and match them up with a job and have them be successful inside the company. So we're seeing cracks in that facade of you have to have a bachelor's or a master's before I'll even talk to you. I would love it if the employers would walk away from that even more quickly than they're doing now.
Academia has to almost walk away from it first in some respects.
We're not going to walk away from that. This is what we do for a living. We credential people, right? This honestly, when I think about what business can actually do to make it change, changing human capital practices is one of the easiest, beneficial to the company, and most profound ways that we can actually be more inclusive, bring more people into the workforce, is to stop this gate that we put up that says you have to go through a 4-year degree first. It's just super inappropriate in a lot of cases.
So one more philanthropy-based question. We'll go back to the audience. So if we're trying to attack the skills gap as a funder, which we are at the Wilson Foundation, we're looking at middle school, middle wage job attainment and retention, not requiring a 4-year degree. Should we be looking differently at how we're stacking, how the community colleges in particular are starting to stack credentials and work? I'm frustrated that we still have a system that only responds to get an associate's degree, get a bachelor's degree.
I think we should be more broad-minded about the kinds of things that we're funding and the experiments that we're participating in. I think an important thing to do is to make sure that we're also supporting the research to go understand what works. The way to, our ability to understand if a program is making a difference or not, that ability has gone up a lot. We have much better evidence, we have much better methods to find out if this approach to giving somebody a decent bundle of skills is better than this approach for giving people a decent bundle of skills. So one thing I would encourage philanthropically minded folk to do, absolutely fund the experiment, fund the innovation, fund the educational approach. Please also spend some time thinking about funding the research to try to figure out if this thing that we're doing is working or not.
That's a great point. It's a terrific point. Other questions? There's one up here.
Hi, Esther.
Esther Dyson. I'd like to take on this skills gap and talk about the culture gap. So to some extent, I think a lot of this training is ultimately for things machines can do, like coding and so forth and so on. If I were trying to design something that was kind of clean and not too invasive, it would be put in the externalities of the jobs along with the EITC. So for example, a teacher has a very long-term impact on many of the kids' lives. We were discussing earlier, a lot of poor kids don't really have a sense of agency or, gee, I couldn't do that kind of job. I don't know anybody who went to college or became a teacher. And so it's seeing a human being in front of you teaching the culture. So as we subsidize work in order to maintain that culture, we can use big data to figure out what the long-term value of teachers, caregivers, nurse-family partnership, things like that are. And that's, of course, a question.
Yeah, and Esther, you and I have talked about this. You know, I categorically agree with this. We are undervaluing a lot of these kinds of jobs in this country right now. Teacher is not an exalted job in a lot of communities. Taking care of very young children, taking care of people in more marginalized communities. Esther is exactly right. The research is now mounting up. The difference between doing that okay and doing that well is a huge lifelong difference for a kid who turns into an adult and turns into somebody with a job. The difference between doing that poorly and doing it okay is also a huge, huge difference. So one of the things that I think we're getting wrong in this country at present is we undervalue and underfund a lot of these early life, very social jobs. And if I've ever come across as kind of a cold technocrat thinking that we just need better apps to teach kids everything, I'm sorry, I need to correct that impression. We need these communities, we need these social environments to get people into the mindset of being part of this community, being able to work, joining this enterprise.
Great. Another question here.
Previously covered my question on education and the role of traditional four-year colleges, community colleges, and so forth, and covered it brilliantly. So let me turn to your comment about Peter Thiel and the one thing with which you agree with Peter, which is that those who advocate critical thinking too often are merely imposing their own doctrine. Another aspect about the problem of critical thinking is that those who advocate it, very, very few of them, when asked, can actually define it.
Yep.
Would you care to take a stab on how to define critical thinking, how to teach it, and how we can do so from a practical standpoint through our traditional education structure or more novel ones?
No. Mainly because it's such a hard question. So it's easy to say we need to teach people to think carefully and clearly and critically. It's extraordinarily hard, like you just pointed out, to even define what we're talking about here. So we just keep doing indoctrination, trying to teach people to look at the world the way I look at the world, because that must be correct. The only answer I can give you, and I love the question, is I think a big part of critical thinking is having the reflex to say, what's the best argument in the other direction? Right? What's the smartest thing I can think of that negates the way I'm thinking right now? And my favorite person talking on this topic is Richard Feynman, one of the great intellects of the 20th century. And luckily enough, he got filmed a lot doing his lectures at Cornell and just kind of doing different things. His thinking is so clear, his language is incredibly clear, and he's brilliant on exactly this point. And he says, look, the way science works is you start with a guess. And he says, I'm not being cute. We have hunches and guesses and whatever like anybody else. And then he says, the job of a real scientist is to go bang on your guess as hard as you can and try to prove it wrong. He said, that's actually what science is. I think that's also a lovely definition, working definition of critical thinking. And one of the things that frustrates the hell out of me is we keep telling people and reinforcing that they should just trust their judgment, have faith in them. No. You should absolutely not. You should start with your judgment, but then go bang on it really, really hard. My favorite business acronym these days is HIPPO, which is highest paid person's opinion. And it really is how most companies still make most of their decisions. It's not terribly evidence-based, it's not terribly rigorous. Someone's got the top of the org chart and they get to make the call. We need to change that pretty quickly. My community of business schools, we're kind of hippo nurseries right now. And the charge that I'm trying to be part of at MIT and at Sloan is to try to teach the students your judgment might be cool, it's really biased and buggy and flawed, and you need to be trying to think of the best argument in the other direction all the time.
Wow.
Thank you for letting me get on that particular soapbox.
So Andrew, we're out of time, but I want to say, first of all, there's a copy of the latest book in the back, Machine, Platform, and Crowd. That's for your pleasure to read. I always find when I read these
that you wish you were doing something else with your time.
after I wake up from the nap.
Then I get a really good night's sleep.
Here I am trying to be serious and end this on a good note. I find that my fears wash away.
Oh, yeah.
And so I can think of no better way to close this session than a Nelson Mandela quote. May your decisions be based on your hopes, not your fears. Thank you so much. Help me thank Andrew.
Thank you.